there's other things for everybody to take home as a reminder to invite your wife to come next week, because we're gonna take and do invite all. Our speaker is Adam Chabot or whatever. He is the head of Egan's Forestry Department. And I suspect a lot of you have noticed a lot of trees going on Egan in the last, the infestation is really taking its toll on our canopy. And so I asked him if there was somebody that wanted it, and he grabbed the opportunity to talk about Egan's canopy beyond just trees, lawns, and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's going to be a fun, informative thing. And it's one of those things actually our wives might enjoy knowing a little bit about. So we printed up the little thing and take one or two or more of them home and share them with other people, because we'd like to see a good crowd hear about this important information.
Well, you keep saying next week.
I keep saying that, but even in a fact, I seen an email that I sent out that said next week. The 12th, I think, of February.
That's the 11th.
11th? Well, what else we did that? If you're working with the second team, you learn to expect. Oh, and last, I want to thank Wes and Corey and Alan. I get a little bit of a, reality. I just show up and watch them work. They just couldn't get over and do it. And it is a fun group that we have. So with that, TY, should I? Okay, all right. Pastor Jay, we have really appreciated you stepping into our congregation and how you just filled the need so nicely. That it's been, your help with my friend Dave passing and his family is so appreciative of what you did those few days. That was extremely appreciated by the family and Dave's friends. So, I'm really interested in who you are, though. How did you end up in this particular course of life, and what is your faith journey? So please share with us your faith journey.
Thanks very much, Al, and all of you for being here. And if there's anybody on, what does that say? Oh, maybe there's somebody on Zoom, I don't know, but it's good to be here. I'm gonna set a timer. It's maybe a dangerous thing to ask a preacher to talk about himself. Go on. So I want to make sure I keep this relatively concise so that there is some time for questions or discussion or sharing your own stories too. I'd be glad to hear about that. And thank you. It's been a real blessing for me to be here at Easter. It was kind of a surprise, as interims are, you don't plan for them. They just kind of come along. And I was in a transition time in my life for me and my family as we were coming back from New Zealand. And of course, this congregation was in transition, so it felt like a good fit, and it has felt like a really good fit. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here in ministry with you. I think it was back in September that TY mentioned the breakfast and then invited me to speak at this breakfast now in January. And I said I'd be glad to if I was still around, because that's the other thing about interim ministry. You don't really know how long you'll be needed for. And as it turned out, the timing is great. I will be here just through the end of the month, so I wouldn't be able to do it in February. I will be making way for hopefully two new pastors will be called. Yeah.
The names? You were gonna give us the names.
No, I'm not involved in that process. And yeah, what was it early on? Remember when Pastor Megan, she had written out an announcement about you ask any questions, just don't ask how long it'll take. And I remember giving her a hard time about that. Now it's ask any questions except who the pastors are. Yeah.
Well, that's gonna tell everybody that you told us anyway.
All right, well, they can't fire me at this. Yeah, so January 29th, Treehouse Sunday will also be my last Sunday here. So, but I'm glad to be with you today. Also, back in September, when TY asked about speaking, I thought, well, maybe what I could speak about would be my time in New Zealand. As some of you know, I spent 2.5 years there in New Zealand with my family, had a great adventure. I could show some slides about it. I like talking about New Zealand. That would be an easy thing to do. Last month, though, when he announced I'd be here, he said I'd be speaking about my faith journey, and I thought that was a good challenge for me. Of course, New Zealand, it was part of my faith journey, but I thought about speaking about my faith journey might be good to help kind of stretch my comfort zone a little bit here in this group. And I think what this breakfast, as I understand it, is about, this group is about getting below the surface level things a little bit, the things that we tend to talk about when we get together, maybe even especially as men, to talk a little bit more about what's really important, what's really going on in our lives, our values, and our relationship with God and with our faith. So I was thinking about that. Thought I could tell my call story. That's something I've done often in many contexts. As pastors, we get kind of practiced at telling how we sensed a call to ministry. I was ordained in 2004, so around that time and during seminary, and with other seminarians, we talk a lot about our call story. So that would be fairly easy. But then, and this is partly inspired by a devotion that Deacon Hans gave. You all know Hans works in youth ministry here. He led a devotion for the staff, and kind of the gist of it was, many of us have our stories about our faith that we like to go back to again and again. Stories of God, where God felt active, especially in our lives, or where we leaned on our faith in special ways. And for me, a call story is one of those stories, and it's good to have those stories. But Hans's point was, we also need new stories, and we need to pay attention to what God is doing in our lives now, not just in the past, but even now. And if you don't have a story like that about how God is at work more recently, then you just need to pay attention more, because God is definitely at work. I really appreciated that message. So what I'd like to talk about today is more recent parts of my faith journey. And rather than talking about my call to be a pastor, I guess more about what I'd like to talk about today is my call to stay a pastor, or to be a pastor again. And a big part of this is because about 6 years, almost exactly 6 years ago, when I left my last settled call, I wasn't sure that I'd be a pastor again. I didn't know, but I had a good sense that maybe I wouldn't be a pastor again. This was at Holy Trinity, where I was last pastor at a congregation in South Minneapolis. And when I left there, that began a time of real vocational discernment, and definitely an important part of my faith journey, I think. So just to back up a little bit, 2008, I was called to be the lead pastor at Holy Trinity. This was my second call after having been in rural Indiana for a few years. And I was very excited to come to Holy Trinity. It's a great church. It was and is a great church with an active ministry. I was really looking forward to that. I was also really excited to be back in Minneapolis. I grew up in Minnesota, Wilmer, Minnesota, but all of my family's in Minneapolis. My parents, my brothers, got a lot of friends here. Southern Indiana, it was a great church there, but rural and a little lonely there sometimes. I sometimes call that my wilderness experience. I was single. There weren't a lot of dating opportunities as a single pastor in rural Indiana. So I was excited to come back here for a lot of reasons. I jumped right in with both feet into the ministry. Really did. I think we did a lot of great work together there during my time there, almost 10 years. Also, I did date and ended up getting married just a year after I started there. So my wife Kristen and I were married at Holy Trinity. A year later, 2 years later, we had our first daughter, Beatrice. 2 years after that, our second daughter, Melina. They were both baptized at Holy Trinity. So this was my community and it was our family's community. And I'd hoped to be there a long time. Sometime in 2016, though, it started to feel like my work there was becoming unsustainable, like something needed to change. Things were going okay. They were going well at the church. We just finished a major remodeling project for the church building, which took some time and energy, but that was completed. But with all that was going on at the church, I felt like I just wasn't seeing my kids very much. And when I did see them, I felt exhausted. Like the church was getting the best of me, and my family was getting what was left over. I often would come. I usually was home for dinner, and then I had to go back for meetings in the evenings, and so felt like somebody different every night was putting my kids to bed, and I was missing out on that. It was great. My parents are in town, my wife's mother. We had a lot of help from the grandparents, so we were relying on the village, but I felt like I was missing out. Also, my wife was really busy. She had just begun her medical career. She's a doctor, and she was trying to figure out what part of practicing medicine she really liked. She liked being in the clinic, but also working in the hospital, rounding there. She was delivering babies, and they don't come according to anyone's timetables. And she was also invited into a leadership position. So she was trying out a lot of things, which meant she was also very busy. So we knew we had to make some decisions about how we wanted to be a family. Again, when I started at Holy Trinity, I was single and eager and had a lot of energy. And in that 10 years, a lot had changed. It was hard to change then the patterns of work that I had established. So there was a question for me about work-life balance, but there's also, I think, a faith question for me. I believed I was called to be a pastor and to be a pastor at Holy Trinity, but I also believed that I was called to be a parent and a husband, as well as a son and a neighbor and a friend and a brother, and we all have many different vocations in our lives that we are called to by God, I think. So I struggled with how I could do all of those things effectively. And what do I do when those callings seem to get in the way of each other? So I wondered if maybe something had called or changed in my call to ministry. Maybe I was no longer called to be a pastor. Again, things were going well. I didn't see there were any external signs that I didn't have a call, but it was more of an internal sense that something needed to change. So things were going okay. So I did feel like the church was in a good spot. There was an associate pastor who was exceptional, who had been there for 3 years. Membership was moving in the right direction slightly, just slightly increasing. So I wanted to see, part of me, I wanted to see where this would go if I stayed, but I eventually decided it was best for me to leave my position at Holy Trinity, become a full-time at-home parent. So this was a big change for me. That's where I felt that God was calling me to be. Now, maybe for a lot of people, this would be an easy decision. Because of my wife's work, financially, we could do it. I could stay home with the kids, but I really struggled with it. Maybe some of you might have heard of the pastor Eugene Peterson. He wrote the Message translation of the Bible. If you've seen that, a nice contemporary paraphrase translation of the Bible. And he's also written a lot about parish ministry. And in one of his books for pastoral ministry, he talks about ministry being a long obedience in the same direction. I always liked that, a long obedience in the same direction. For pastors, it can be a great thing for a congregation to have that kind of stability. You know that here at Easter, we had a pastor here who was here for decades, and that can provide a lot of stability for a congregation, a lot of health and stability. But leaving then, after just 10 years, felt like I was giving up on that I was quitting, that I was giving up on or failing in my obedience, in my duty to that congregation and to that call. I think it also just goes against my nature to quit something. I'm probably not the only one in the room who maybe feels that way, would rather be called just about anything than a quitter. Maybe especially for men, we value perseverance and, just grinding it out. There's also a little Scandinavian stoicism in me. Like, I don't want to admit any vulnerability or emotion even. So that can be a hard thing. That the phrase man up in its negative sense can contribute to that. Like, to be a man means not acknowledging that anything is wrong, rather than the way I think this group uses it in a much more positive way. But at the same time, I believe that changing direction can be the right thing. And looking back, I don't have any regrets at all about it. It was the right thing for me, but it did involve a fair amount of trust to believe that God was still calling me into this next chapter, even though it felt like I was leaving something behind that I liked a lot. The other difficulty is I didn't know if I would ever get a call again. It's not a guaranteed thing to get another call to be a pastor. I didn't know if I would want to work in another church because I had liked that church so much. I assumed I did, but I wasn't sure. So that took some trust too, to convince myself there would be something again in the future for me. So I told a colleague at church that I was taking an extended sabbatical from pastoral ministry, that I wasn't giving up entirely. It was an extended sabbatical. And she said, I think you should call it your sabbatical. So because I was going home to be a parent, it's my sabbatical. So I embraced that. And I even started a blog called Sabbatical. I just took it down a couple weeks ago, so you can't look it up anymore, but it was sabbatical.com. And I use that to think about, just kind of reflect on this experience of being away from pastoral ministry. So I'll read a couple paragraphs though from my first blog post on sabbatical. I wrote this. Unlike a sabbatical, I'm not taking a break in order to rest, spending all day doing laundry, cooking meals, washing dishes, getting kids dressed and where they need to be, convincing them to practice piano and eat something healthy and brush their teeth and not bug their, on and on. You get the idea, I'll skip ahead. But it didn't feel like a rest at all, in other words. But like a sabbatical, I'm carving out some space for reflection. Maybe I will return to serve a church again as a pastor, and maybe not. But if I do, I hope I will go back different. I want to have enough time away to learn new things about myself and the church's work in the world today. I want to establish new patterns and practices that can continue to serve me even while leading a congregation. Perhaps this blog can be a tool for reflection, conversation, and learning to help me become both a better pastor and a better parent. So I have done a lot of reflection, and writing for me is an important way of doing that reflection, both about my own feelings, what's going on, and also how God may be at work in my life. I find journaling is an important faith practice for me. I don't do it a lot, probably as much as I could or should, but I try not to feel guilty about that. I don't think faith practices should be things that we feel guilty about. Like, we're not praying enough or we're not reading the Bible enough. They're there for tools for us that we can use and to make use of as much as we can, but it shouldn't become a burden or a source of guilt. But I have found that writing is an important thing for me to pay attention to what God is doing in my life. I wrote a lot in the past 6 years. It's about where I've been and where God may be leading me. I also, in that time, this sabbatical time, I started a podcast, which was a fun thing. Again, it was short-lived, so you can't find it online anymore. It was called Parsonage, and another friend and I started it. He's also a pastor's kid, like I am, a PK. So we interviewed other PKs about their experience growing up in the church, having a parent working in the church. And that was a lot of fun and good to kind of reflect on these multiple callings in my life as well. During all of this time, as it turned out, I didn't take a complete break from parish ministry. I did some preaching and covering for other vacations or sabbaticals of other friends who were pastors. Well, and then in 2018, October, the synod asked me to work at a church in Edina as an interim there. One of the pastors there was actually a classmate of mine at both Concordia and seminary, died suddenly, young. Well, I would say young because she was my age. She had 3 young kids. So that was a tragic thing. And I went in and just helped for about a year for that congregation as an interim. So that was my first official interim ministry. Then we went to New Zealand, which was a fun adventure as a family. And there I quickly got involved with the Anglican church because there weren't any Lutherans around. So I got my credentials recognized and was able to help lead worship at our local church occasionally, even worked in the office there. So in these past 6 years, I think one thing I've discovered is that being a pastor is still something I enjoy. It's still something I feel called to do and called to be as well. And being here has been confirmation of that too. So I want to thank you all and this congregation for this opportunity to join you in ministry as I've felt this call to go back into full-time parish ministry at this new season in my family's life. It's been really great for me in this transition to be here with all of you. I've seen signs of God's work in my life as I've seen signs of God's work in this congregation's life, especially in the call process. I'm really excited about the new pastors who are coming to be with you here. And I think I've just discovered that being a pastor is a part of who I am, even when I'm not leading in a congregation. That's why I got so quickly involved in other churches. It seems like it's something that I can't not do. But it's a part of who I am, kind of a part of, it's like the lens through which I see the world. It's through this lens of pastoral ministry, even when I'm not working in a church, just like I am a parent. Even when my kids aren't here with me, I'm still a parent. And I think I feel the same way about being a pastor as well. It's not all that I am. I'm also a parent and a husband and a friend and so on, all of those other things. And before all of those things, I am a child of God. That's most important before anything I do or don't do. But serving as a pastor is one way that I am called to be in the world. So thank you for listening to my story about how I see God at work in more recent parts of my faith journey. And maybe you found some resonance in your own life with your own journey, and I'd love to hear about that either now or another time too. But I'll just leave it here so that if anybody, do you have any questions or comments or stories to tell in response to this? Yeah.
To the average layman who doesn't necessarily know all that a PK goes through,
Yeah.
in your podcast, interviewing other PKs, what would we want to hear? What would be interesting for us that we don't know?
Yeah, there's some great things. I will say almost all of the people we interviewed had generally positive things to say about being a PK, but there's some things that weren't. There were a couple who had mostly negative things to say. I'll share one story. Let's see. Well, first I'll tell a story from my dad. He wasn't on the podcast, but my dad has told me he very well remembers, because my dad's a pastor. My grandfather was also a pastor in Minneapolis. So my dad was a PK too. And he remembers as a kid, he had 4 sisters. He remembered one summer they packed up the car, station wagon, I'm sure, packed up to go on a vacation. And then his dad came home. They were ready to go. The phone rang, and someone in the congregation had died. They needed to plan a funeral, and they called off the vacation, and they unpacked the car, and so that was, he very distinctly remembers that. I don't know how often that kind of thing happened, but I know that my grandfather worked more than he should have too. So my dad, knowing that, tried to set good boundaries about that too, because that was something he was aware of. But I heard stories like that from other PKs about how it felt like the family life had to take a backseat to the church's life. What was? Yeah, I think it mostly has to do with people feeling like their pastor parent just wasn't around very much. The other thing is sometimes PKs, it's hard to be at church as a PK. I remember as a kid in Sunday school, if a teacher asked a question, everybody looked at me, they assumed I knew the answer.
The answer was.
The answer was Jesus, right? But it's the assumption that, well, you must just talk about the Bible all the time when you're at home, like that's it, well, we just wanted to be regular kids too. So I think there can be a lot of pressure. There is the people say, pastors' kids tend to go one of two directions. Either they're the really wild kids or the ones who go into seminary and become a pastor, or a little bit of both. Yeah, that's right.
You did both.
I did both. Yeah. As far as everyone knew at the church, though, I was a good kid. Yeah.
A pastor's kid once told me that her dad, they always went camping because they couldn't be reached.
Yeah.
That was their way of getting away from the house.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's harder to find those camping places where you don't get a cell phone coverage.
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
yeah. No, I like trips to the Boundary Waters.
I assume your wife got an appointment over in New Zealand that you went over
Yeah,
there?
that's why we went there. My wife had spent a month in New Zealand during her medical school training. She needed to do a residency or a rotation. She chose in tropical medicine. So she had her dad, who's also a family physician. She also followed her father's footsteps. But he had a former colleague who was in New Zealand. So she went there and spent a month there in the far north. So then that was before we were married. Then when we were as a family thinking it'd be fun to do an overseas experience, first we thought about Costa Rica because our kids have been taking Spanish. They went to Spanish immersion daycare and we'd like to continue that. And we wanted to be in the same time zone roughly. So, well, New Zealand wasn't any of those things, but it turned out, she said, maybe I should call them. That was a fun experience. Maybe we could go to New Zealand. And she did call them and they said, yeah, when can you start? They're just really desperate for healthcare workers there, especially in rural New Zealand. So that's how we ended up there. So we went, it was initially going to be a year. Then we found out, we decided we wanted to get to know the community a little bit better. And we found out if you get a 2 to 5 year visa, you could qualify for the national health care. So that saved us a lot of money by committing to 2 years there. So I went, with a visa dependent on her work as an essential worker. And so I didn't have a job when I got there. But then I quickly got involved with that church, the Anglican church. And then I also taught drums while I was there, which was a lot of fun. It's always been a hobby of mine to play drums and percussion. I played in percussion at Concordia College. And more recently, I've gotten into drum set playing. And so that was a lot of fun. I ended up having 25 students at one point. The pandemic kind of made that a little bit difficult at some points, but it's not something I would have been able to do here. There's so many music majors, music teaching majors here, and especially in Minnesota. But they were glad to have an American drummer come in and teach them. So yeah, that's another thing I feel really was a gift to me to be able to do something totally different from my other work. Wow. Yeah.
So I have two things. One is kind of a statement. I was a Catholic for about 62 years. And one of the things that I always, the big argument about should priests be married or not.
Yeah.
The one thing that I always thought, good reason to not be married, was what you described, trying to be a dad and I've seen that in a number of pastors over the years, my wife's always been. That we have met where it's, you can do it, it's just a lot harder.
Yeah, I had a friend, who was a Catholic priest, and I remember being a little bit jealous, like, the church just kind of took care of him, he had someone come in and clean the house and cook his meals and all of that. Not really the life that I feel called to, but that, and I think maybe as Lutherans, we've inherited that model of the pastor is always available for anything, but it doesn't work as well, when you've got a family. So I think Easter has had, maybe the call committee members here can say, I think you've had some conversation about that, wanting to respect boundaries, and I think there are good things in place here at Easter. Having more than one pastor helps for one thing. Only one pastor is really on call at any given time, and there's a supportive environment here. And I think people here recognize that their pastors have lives outside of the church too, and have not just lives, but callings from God beyond being a pastor too. So I hope that you'll support your new pastors in that, and being, I don't know who they are, but if they have kids or if they have spouses, that you support them in the ways they live out God's calling and in those relationships too.
Did you do any fly fishing?
I didn't. I have a great friend who was going to come to go fly fishing, because he's an expert. I found that people who fly fish are almost always, if they do it, they're pretty fanatical about fly fishing. I don't know, but he wanted to come and do that. But then with COVID, that didn't happen. So I did some fishing, just out in some deep sea fishing, which I'd never done before, which was a lot of fun. Yeah.
They dealt with COVID rather well.
They did, yeah. I was saying, it helps to be on an island and with the pandemic, so they closed the borders, but then the lockdown was really serious. So you could not leave the house unless you're going to the grocery store, really, or to exercise. But you couldn't drive somewhere and go exercise. So you could only walk out your house. We lived on the beach, but we weren't allowed to swim, because that would, you'd be at risk of needing emergency services, and so they didn't want to, strain those systems. So we could walk on the beach, and that was it. But that was about 6 weeks, and then COVID was eliminated, and we could travel all around. It was weird to be even going to music festivals in 2020, and our friends back here, we're still staying at home mostly. It was a strange time. And then with Delta, when Delta got that, COVID came back into the community, and then it was more being like things were here in Minnesota. Did you have a question?
I did. We had at our church a number of interim pastors over just 7 years. And I'm just really curious, what are the advantages and disadvantages of interim pastorhood as opposed to a permanent?
Yeah.
Permanent.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I have really enjoyed this interim and the other interim that I did. But I really feel now a call to what they call a settled call or to ministry. In fact, I have received a call. That's one of the reasons why I'm finishing up here. So I'm going to be serving as a pastor at Holy Cross Lutheran, which is just a couple miles from my house. So this is a really great thing that I'm excited about. I didn't kind of see coming, and it's God's been at work in the call process for me, just as God has been at work in this call process for Easter. So that's what I feel called to, because I really value the long-term relationship of helping to lead a community, helping to shape a community as well. I feel like I've just gotten to know Easter, and that's part of my grief about leaving now after 4 months. So it'd be, I don't know, maybe it's my personality. It'd be hard for me to continue in a lot of interims. Pastor Jen really feels called to interim ministry, and I think she's excellent at it. I think some of the gifts that are required are being able to kind of become aware and observe and analyze systems quickly, and being, able to not only jump in to help facilitate them moving, but maybe provide some guidance in how things could change. And I think she's got a really good systems view of things in pastoral ministry, and leadership that way. So I think it's some different gifts that maybe are required. Yeah, I'm not, and being here as an associate is a little different than being as a lead interim, and I think Pastor Jen has done both of those too, but I should let her speak for herself. For me, a lot of it, as I said, is I was in transition, and this church needed a transitional pastor as well, so it was a little bit more situational for me to be in interim ministry. Jen and some others have gone through more intentional training to be an intentional interim than I have. There are classes for that. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Grandfather was a pastor, your father. What did you adopt from them? Say, I'm gonna do this. What did you say? I ain't gonna do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, because when I was growing up, I did not want to be a pastor, kind of partly because of that pressure of being a pastor's kid, those kinds of things. But what did I adopt? That's a great question. I have learned a lot about my grandfather. He was a pastor in North Minneapolis, church called Hope Lutheran. It's now left the ELCA, but up on Emerson, I think. One thing I really appreciate is that he saw himself as a leader for the church and also as a community leader. So people in the neighborhood knew him, not even if they didn't go to the church. He had a great relationship with the Catholic parish right across the street there. And they even had shared youth group things that they did, Lutheran and Catholic. So he really did a lot of great community work, and that's something I value, and it's one thing I liked about this community care position at Easter, is it's pastoral care for the congregation, but also working with community partnerships like Treehouse and others. So I think there's real value in that for pastoral ministry. When I was at my last church, we had a position that we called the parish outreach leader, and we use that word parish intentionally ambiguously, meaning parish as the congregation, but also the old sense of the geographical area of a community. And so this person's job was to care for the neighborhood, including the church, but also just the neighborhood. So I like that model, and I think, well, Easter talks about blurring the lines between church and community, and I think that's important. Yeah, and let's see, from my dad, I think my dad has spent a lot of time and energy on worship planning and putting together worship experiences that are innovative and reach different people, and I think that's something that's also been important to me. And my dad has done a better job, and sometimes better than I have, in those boundaries between work and home. I think like one thing I've said is, for me, yeah, I'm aware of it, but I'm also part of the culture, and it's hard to make those changes to set good boundaries, because as a pastor, you want to be of help and serve, and you, especially like when I was getting started, I had a lot of energy. I've been training for a long time for this work. I wanted to do it, and it's hard to say, okay, it's hard to be patient sometimes too, and say, I've got time to do these things, I don't have to do it all at once. So, but I've learned a lot from my dad in the way he has recognized, and he's said many times, I like my work, but it's not who I am. It's not all that I am. So I've appreciated that. Anything else?
Awesome.
We should wrap up. Thank you.